Settle in and breathe. Tonight we drift through the dance of the dragons, soft, slow, and epic in hush. If this calms you, tap subscribe, like, and leave a thought. It keeps these bedtime journeys alive. Lights low, shoulders loose. Let Westeros exhale around you and share where you're listening from. Summer held the realm like a slow heartbeat, steady and warm, as if peace were a quilt you could pull to your chin and forget the wind outside. In halls of red stone and green gardens, lords walked softly because memory still smelled of dragon smoke and old oaths, and the throne remembered every back that leaned toward it. Across the narrow sea, the ghosts of Valyria drifted like ash in a sunbeam, and in Westeros, the last embers of that city wore crowns and told themselves that embers are enough to warm a century. A king with gentle hands learned to love the easy hour after supper, when the music settled and the wine went calm, and a daughter laughed with the confidence of a lighthouse in clear weather. Names gathered like birds on a wall, whispering the future, but the wind that moves birds does not ask their leave. In the year when the lords came like a constellation to vote on a storm still beyond the horizon, every rider, scribe, and servant felt how important it is to place a stone in a river and pretend the water will flow around it forever. They called it a great council because the realm wanted the word great to carry the weight of righteous sleep. A woman with salt in her blood and iron in her spine stood at the threshold of a crown and heard doors close with manners. Rhaenys knew the sound of a polite no, the kind that sows centuries. Viserys smiled like summer, not because he was blind, but because some men choose soft sunlight even when clouds study the map. The lords lifted their hands, and the air shifted, and in that hush, the realm nudged its future toward the gentler branch, and away from the stormflower whose roots were already tasting stone. From that day forward, a seed traveled quietly in saddlebags and library corners, in betrothal papers, and glances held a heartbeat too long, and the seed was resentment, watered by grace, sunned by courtesy, fed by time. Years walked in without knocking, and a princess grew under tapestries where dragons looked down like grandparents who remember a different kind of song. She learned the smell of ink and the texture of maps, the way a court smiles with teeth hidden by words like tradition and prudence, the way friends can lean apart without moving their feet. In a garden of glass where bees wrote loops in warm air, a girl named Alicent laughed beside her, both of them certain that mornings are endless and that a king's word seals the sky. Viserys set a crown in the invisible space above his daughter's head and said what fathers say when love and duty align long enough to be photographed by memory. "You will inherit this," he breathed. "The iron and the dust, the promises and the ghosts, the roses in the courtyard, and the snow at the end of every song." The realm clapped softly like rain starting, but rain feeds both wheat and weeds. On a shore where the wind laces salt into everything, a family of the sea braided alliances the way sailors coil ropes, neatly, with hope, with a certain lie that ropes never tangle in a storm. Drift marks smelled of brine and pride, and the old friendship between ships and dragons. And on a night riddled with grief, a pyre bent the air, while children memorized the taste of sorrow too soon. Above them loomed a mountain with wings, a grandmother of fire, a widow of cities, Vaga, whose breath was the attic of history opening again. A boy with a wound made of laughter he had not received, a boy who measured himself against shadows, walked into a legend's yawn, and decided that fear is a tax you can pay in secret. He put his hand to an age, and the age took his hand, and the bargain wrote itself in scales older than memory. The dragon rose, and the boy became larger inside his own name. Some nights changed the grammar of a century. This was one. In the corridors of stone and amber light, children tangled their futures in a room too small for what they were carrying. Words were tossed like knives made of sugar. The truth, which adults think is a heavy thing, proved light enough to throw. The storm broke where storms always break. In the last place a mother would look. When the air settled, an eye was gone, and a lesson stood where it had been. The price of keeping power is paid by those not permitted to spend it. Mothers wept with stone in their throats, and fathers learned again how clumsy men are when handling destinies. Rhaenyra watched the river she had been promised begin to braid with another river neither map had planned, and the sound of that braiding kept her awake even when she finally slept. Viserys, weary and gentle, tried to pour oil on water and discovered that oil only shines in moonlight. By day it smells like regret. He held his realm together with the soft adhesive of patience, with dinners and reconciliations and stories about the dead when names were simpler, and some nights he succeeded, and the music turned the knives back into forks. But bones whisper in the presence of old iron, and the throne has a sense of smell. Time, which ignores the dignity of kings, began to loosen the knots in Viserys's body and steal the sentences he urgently meant to say. Pains set up small tents in his joints and behind his eyes. He walked halls he had memorized and found new shadows there. He reached for his wife and found a different winter. He reached for his daughter and felt a summer trying to be brave. He reached for sleep and felt its mouthful of teeth. On the last evening when candles behaved and the air honored his breath by matching it, he looked into the fabric of all he had loved and tried to thread one more needle. A story older than his bones pushed through his lips, half prophecy, half father's plea, and the pieces fell like coins rolling under a table. People who wanted to hear certainty picked up certainty. People who needed a door cracked open found a draft. The night folded itself into morning, and morning brought two versions of duty to the same breakfast table. In a green room where bolts slid home with a kindness that fooled no one, a council gathered like surgeons who have decided the patient cannot be told. They counted rules and found a crown in the cupboard of convenience. They seed what men say when speed is the only virtue left. It must be done, and we will apologize to memory later. A city held its breath while riders wore the streets thin, searching not for a good king, but for the king who could be crowned before the sentence ended. They found him where boys hide when the future hunts, and they washed his face with just enough mercy to make him presentable to history. Under sun that felt like a verdict, the trumpets remembered their job, and the crowd discovered its talent for cheer. Gold caught fire and green grew brighter. Somewhere in the shade, a mother closed her eyes and measured the distance between love and fear. Across black water that speaks in patient syllables, a different fire lit a different hall, and the sea brought its salt to bless a promise made long ago in a garden. Rhaenyra rose like a star seen from a ship, steady, unblinking, dangerously reassuring. A crown older than most arguments found her brow without hesitation, and men who had known her since she rode small dragons watched the future kneel before a memory of summer. The waves stamped their quiet approval against stone. Two songs began to sing atop one another, and even the ravens tilted their heads as if to ask which tune to carry. At Dragonstone the air tasted of iron and brine, and the ache of a body that had been asked to carry too many meanings at once. A mother labored for life while messengers labored for advantage. Windows framed a sea that did not care which language vows use. Men wrote pledges as if ink could be armor. Women gripped hands as if bone could be bridge. The babe that did not stay left a silence loud enough to hear across years. Grief rearranged furniture that politics had set. When she stood again, Rhaenyra was the sort of quiet that causes flames to lean. Tables carved into maps glowed like coals under her palms, and the old volcano of rule muttered in the deep of her chest. She counted ships, riders, debts, winters, and the number of people who had dared to love her without asking for change. She sent sons into winds that had never heard their names, and asked the winds to be kind. In the Red Keep, corridors where children had played now smelled of ink that refuses to dry. Men in careful boots stepped over history like it was a sleeping dog. They spoke tenderly of order, as you might speak to a frightened horse. They valued speed because conscience was out of fashion. The city dreamed of bread while the castle dreamed of diagrams. On the morning when both dreams woke to each other, banners rippled like answers that don't fit the question, and the first ravens flapped off with their black parchments filled with directions to grief. And still there were soft minutes in gardens, where sunlight warmed the stone benches, and young lovers misunderstood the scale of things and promised forever without knowing the price of even next week. And still there were kitchens, where laughter dodged the knives and onions surrendered to butter, and soldiers leaned their spears, and old women hummed, and the world pretended it was not a stage for dragons. But the sky had begun to listen again, and when the sky listens, the ground becomes careful. A boy who had offered an eye to a storm now wore his pride like armor, heavy and polished, and louder than wisdom. On nights when moonlight pooled in cold courtyards, he walked inside a certainty that could not be reasoned with, only answered. Another boy who had learned the language of gentleness the hard way, who had been asked to be brave without applause, took wing toward weather. At storm's end, the rain drummed polite but insistent fingers against old stone, while boasts hung from rafters like flags stained by previous victories. A messenger with sea still clinging to his cloak breathed the words his mother had pressed into his mouth. But thunder has its own schedule, and in the yard 2 histories met beneath one sky. On the flight home, the clouds discovered their talent for violence. Wings wrote terrified scripture across the dark. A lesson as old as brothers tore the page before it was finished. When the storm swallowed its witness, a mother's world changed its shape forever. On Dragonstone, the news moved like a knife underwater, and everything that had been soft found shelter or vanished. In the capital, wine lost its flavor for those who could still taste. A hall that had heard too much music stood too straight, as if bracing for accusation. Between 2 councils, quiet settled not as peace settles, but as dust settles after the breaking of something beloved. The Green Council learned how victory can make you thirsty. They set guards at doors and said the doors were open. They balanced laws on the heads of pins and declared the pins unbendable. They burned letters with clean fingers. They rehearsed their explanations in case history arrived early and requested a hearing. The Black Council learned how sorrow sharpens the lines on a map. They spoke with the North, whose voice is stone wrapped in snow. They spoke with the Vale, which listens from heights designed for reconsideration. They spoke with the Riverlands, where every oath must cross water twice. A smile too small to be wore sat on every treaty's lip, and yet that smile learned teeth. A girl who had once giggled in gardens now learned how to count the silent things. Glances, pauses, door bolts, the pressure of a hand on a chair back when a name is spoken. A queen who had once ridden through morning air, with hair wild and joy unguarded, now braided her days tight and moved through rooms like a blade in velvet. The throne watched her and watched the city and remembered that iron is patient. Some evenings she stood beneath woven dragons on bright banners and felt the absence of a friend like a brood she had to hide from herself. Some nights she visited children dreaming and asked sleep to be complicated. She could feel the realm measuring her in units she had not chosen. On the day when drums at last remembered what drums are for, the city flooded its streets with a celebration engineered to drown doubt. People are good at cheering the moment they are handed. Fear and hope wear the same shoes from a distance. Bells lifted their skirts and ran down the towers. Aegon held a sword the way a boy holds a difficult future. A dragon glittered like a lie told beautifully. The people roared because roaring is warmer than hunger. By afternoon, the wine had done enough work to make certainty taste like truth. Across the bay, a crown that smelled of salt and old smoke rested on hair tangled by wind, and oaths wrapped themselves around wrists and throats and throbbing temples. The sea kept time with small applause. Fire lit the carved table, illuminating rivers like veins and castles like joints. And the island understood that birth and war are both labors with different lullabies. She sent her sons again, because duty is a tide, and mothers have always known that tides ignore prayer. One rode toward snow and the long quiet that turns boys into pages of legend. One rode toward storms already rehearsing their lines. The ravens went, the riders went, the sighs went, the prayers went, and a silence remained, large enough to set a kingdom on it for a moment and think it sturdy. In that silence, the dragons themselves began to listen. And when dragons listen, men tend to shout. Somewhere in the palace, a woman sat with her children and counted the kinds of safety she could not give them. Somewhere in a tower, a man who loved books more than triumphs realized that stories often end in the very chapter that seemed safest. Somewhere in a courtyard, an old knight rubbed at a scar that always tingled when history approached. Somewhere in a cellar, a boy practiced being cruel to a mouse, and somewhere in a chapel a girl practiced being kind to a candle, and both learned skills their elders would later admire. Evening after evening, the city tried to be ordinary, to let laundry happen, and bread rise, and quarrels end in yawns. But the air had thickness where it had once had ease, an invisible syrup that slowed certain words and made others slip too quickly. All through those days and nights, the memory of an eye and the rumor of a storm braided into a rope that halved the realm and tugged until skin reddened. All through those days and nights, mothers rehearsed news they prayed never to deliver, and fathers tightened belts not for hunger, but for courage. All through those days and nights, the throne waited like a cat in sunlight, pretending to sleep. Then came the moment that kingdoms always claim surprised them, the moment that arrives exactly on time wearing the mask of accident. A raven landed where it had been told to land and offered its throat to the message. A door opened for someone it would not close behind. A corridor exhaled and remembered blood. In the black chambers where plans stalk in stocking feet, a whisper chose a cup. Outside, hooves clopped calmly, and inside, a history turned on a hinge that had been greased years ago with good intentions. When he fell without music. When the news stood upright and walked into the light, people arranged their faces into legal shapes. Justice often arrives late and tired, but it still wears the crown to bed. The realm blinked and found the fires lower than before, the dragons counting their breaths, the children of dragons learning arithmetic by subtraction. A boy who feared fire more than he feared loneliness touched the metal made to test men and quietly decided to become the sort of king who keeps candles at bay by keeping windows open. A girl who had survived too much too young braided her hair higher and learned to speak in rooms where the air itself asked questions. Men who had shouted learned to whisper. Women who had whispered learned when to become the shout. The dance began not with drums, but with a long inhale, the kind that makes a room remember it has a roof. And from that breath forward, every step, every wing beat, every prayer, every lie, every kiss that tasted of salt, every bed that held a body awake, belonged to the same slow, terrible, beautiful waltz that would teach the world how costly it is to be born near dragons. Yet in that same breath, there were lanterns lit for reasons that will always matter. Love, loyalty, stubborn hope, the simple discipline of kindness, and those small flames burned steady, even as the great fires argued with the sky. So the realm lay down each night on pillows stuffed with feathers and futures, and listened to the hoofbeats of messengers fading into the dark, and to the sea reciting its patient alphabet, and to the far, far off thrum of wings rehearsing the next page, and tried for a few hours at a time to sleep. Night turned its face to the wall and would not look at the sea again. A mother wrapped her arms around the absence where her youngest had been, and the room remembered how to be cold. Names used to be lanterns. Tonight they were stones in a pocket, pulling at the hem of the world. Grief did not knock. It entered like wind through a crack, everywhere at once. A quiet that pressed on the ribs until breath learned to whisper. Ravens went out wearing black that felt truer than ink. They carried messages with hands in them, the kind that close around throats even when written in calligraphy. The island listened the way volcanoes listen, through rock and memory, through heat that pretends to sleep. She stood at the carved table and laid her palm on the river that had stolen a son, and the river did not apologize. There is a justice that moves like tide, and a justice that moves like teeth. This night chose teeth. In city honeycombs, where footsteps learned to hold their breath, two men followed a tunnel of rumors toward a door that was a question with only one answer. They had been promised coin, and then something colder than coin. They had been promised that the weight in one woman's chest could be made lighter by placing weight on another's. It is a lie, and it is true. The hallways of a red castle inhaled and exhaled without sound. The candles thought of moths. Behind a wall that had memorized lullabies, a queen held her children the way a wolf holds winter, gently, and also with the memory of teeth. Voices asked for keys that were not keys. A name was offered, and then a choice, and then a smaller room where the air ran out of places to stand. The nursery smelled of sleep and milk, and the faint metal of crowns kept in other rooms. Night reached into a cradle and came back with history under its nails. A sound like glass breaking inside a body did not echo. It nested. A mother bent around the space that used to be a child and learned new shapes for prayers. Some griefs do not lessen, they divide, and every piece is sharp. When the men left, the corridor changed their shadows without asking permission. They stepped into a city that did not know it had been rearranged. The Red Keep learned how to keep secrets it wished to forget. The realm learned how the price of dragons is paid by the small and the soft. From the island came a silence with edges. It crossed the water faster than ships. Words like answer and debt and balance sharpened in mouths until they cut the speakers, and the blood tasted of iron and oath. A prince who laughed at doom stirred beneath black towers that drank moonlight like wine. He listened to the new sound the realm made and recognized the chord. In the north, where breath becomes story and snow keeps counsel, a dragon's son brought a mother's banner to a lord who had learned weather's language. The hall smelled of pine smoke and iron honesty. Cregan spoke in stones. He did not promise summer, he promised standing. Oaths were exchanged like blades inspected for cracks. The wolf and the dragon shook hands over a winter that had not yet announced itself. Far to the east, the sea ate a message and coughed it up on another beach. Far to the south, an old house counted ships, as if the coin in the counting might change the number. Everywhere, mothers held children tighter in doorways and watched the sky as if it were a ledger. In the capital, gold cloaks practiced the art of being already present when trouble arrives. The market learned the new price of bread hour by hour, as if time itself had become currency. In the sept, a woman knelt among candles that could not decide whether to comfort or accuse. She rocked and hummed a tune that used to mean sleep and now meant water closing over a small face. Her fingers traced circles on stone as if drawing a door out of there. The city looked away because looking was a wound. Whispers wore boots and hurried. A dragon on a crimson morning lifted its head and knew its rider had made a decision. Melees shook embers from her feathers of fire and blinked as if remembering a joke told by the sun. The queen, who had refused to grow quiet in any age, swung into the saddle like a truth refusing to bend. Air loved her for a heartbeat, then feared her. She rose, a red comet with memory in its wake, and turned toward a shore where green grew smug. Rook's rest lay like a clenched hand at the edge of the world. Men on the walls watched her approach, and for a moment remembered their first mornings as boys, the ones where nothing had gone wrong yet and everything smelled like bread. Trumpets lied. They tried to be larger than the sky. The sky explained itself with wings. She dove like a bell rung upside down, red sound crashing into spears, into shutters, into bones that had believed roofs were promises. Fire folded streets into sheets of tomorrow's ash. Below, orders shouted themselves hoarse. Above, the world became diagrams of heat, and then the horizon made a decision. Vhagar came like a cathedral learning how to fly again. Old thunder remembered where it lives. Sunfire followed. Gold as arrogance, bright as a crown that thinks itself inevitable. 3 histories stood on one sheet of sky and asked it to choose. Blades of flame crossed like signatures done in a tremor. Meleys looked at age and laughed. She had known cities that thought themselves permanent. She had eaten kings and mercy in the same mouthful. She cut gold and bit storm. Below, men craned their necks and felt their sizes. The air filled with dragon voice, which is also the sound of everything finding out what it costs. Vhagar's shadow fell, and the town could not lift it. Sunfire's glare burned a new noon into the morning. Meleys danced a last lesson, crimson against blue, her rider thinking of daughters and of choices that had seemed smaller when made. When the collision came, it wrote pain into the day so deeply that even the river tried to forget. Gold screamed. Red bled light. Old bone descended with a memory of conquest and turned memory into present tense. Feathers of fire tore loose and became small separate suns, falling through a world suddenly crowded with endings. On the ground, men ran toward duties they had not rehearsed, and those who hid learned the geometry of fear behind barrels and doors. In the wreck of sky, something bright broke, and crowns found out what gravity thinks of them. Sunfire crashed with the stubborn grace of royalty meeting floorboards. His rider coughed smoke and royal blood into grass that did not care about ancestry. Vhagar rode the wind like a law that forgot mercy's footnote. Meleys answered with a rasp that sounded like an old song refusing to be erased. Together they fell through blue that would be talked about for years by old men who would claim they were there. When it was done, stones remembered heat for weeks. The town counted its dead in the quiet after, which is a louder sound than battle. Riders whispered new words into bandages. Messengers drank water too fast and threw up hope in doorways. The news ran ahead of the horses all the way to the city and the island, and to houses that would never matter, except for the child who would once remember watching smoke in that sky. In the capital, a king learned another way to be broken. He asked questions in a voice that tried to wear armor and could only manage bandages. His dragon lay like a lion with bees in its throat. Healers made circles with their hands over wounds that had names and over wounds that did not. In rooms where decisions grow like vines, men watered themselves with fear and called it prudence. They turned the city inward, made it a fist. In the alleys, bread forgot how to be enough. The price of flour developed ambition. Mothers counted copper and then counted their children and found the sums did not meet in the middle. A preacher's voice discovered its purpose. He spoke the way fires speak in drought, fast and looking for tinder. He named dragons sin and rulers blasphemy and hunger justice. People who had lost the habit of listening to themselves listened to him. They wore their anger like a new cloak in winter and found it warmer than shame. Rumors walked arm in arm with truths, and no one asked to see papers. At night, the lamps made promises they could not keep about safety. By day, the sun found new angles from which to insult the poor. In the island hall, a queen took each new death into her ledger and did not misplace it. She wrote strategy over sorrow until the letters blurred and had to be traced again. She sent for dragonseeds because the old blood had not been entirely spent, only scattered like sparks into lower rooms. In caves where old fire naps and wakes, new riders learned the difference between fear and respect. A boy learned to bow to something that did not need his bow. A girl learned to feed a hunger that could incinerate her, and saw in its eye a kind of fairness. Across the narrow sea, Celsails did arithmetic with the wind and the price of their souls. In the riverlands, banners rose like reeds waking from a bad dream. Old keeps remembered their first stones being laid, and in that memory found the courage to say no to storms that had not yet arrived. Aemond rode long and silent, his breath a metronome for deeds that didn't want drums. Villages learned his name in past tense and future threat. Harrenhal received him with the same kindness it offers to rain, indifference edged by echo. He sat in halls that had listened to older fires and felt at home in their ruin. Daemon answered with a smile sharpened into a plan. Between them stretched a lake that pretended to be glass and was, in fact, a mouth. Men on either shore felt their chests tighten for reasons they called weather. Ravens crossed overhead carrying the number 2. Under a moon that had opinions, the dragons rose from their respective silences and wrote opposing sentences across the water. Below, fish broke the surface for reasons unrelated to destiny. Above, destiny sharpened its quills. Steel does not matter very much when mountains with hearts meet in the sky. They came together like storms hurrying toward the same harbor. The first impact made the air ring like a struck bell held too tightly. Claws found purchases that maps don't mark. Teeth tested old myths and found them plausible. The riders were two different kinds of certainty. The lake had time to see them in reflection before the fight turned the surface into text. Night watched, the way predators watch other predators, interested but unwilling to intervene. When it ended, it did not end. One fell in ragged grace, trailing the lights of 1,000 remembered torches. One followed with the gravity of history deciding to rest. Men on the shore stood very still, afraid to make the moment personal. Ripples went outward, counting slowly. On the island, a woman felt something leave the room without using the door. In the city, another woman felt something arrive that wore his perfume and his absence. The realm made another small, permanent adjustment to how it held itself upright. For a while after, the sky learned to be empty again. Birds were relieved and then confused by their own relief. On cobbles in the capital, dragons bled on rumors and rumors bleached bones. A city accustomed to victorious processions saw litters instead, saw shutters close, saw banners droop as if they had fevers. The shepherd's sermons grew teeth that bit even those he blessed. When bread cost more than dignity, men do not usually choose dignity. Night after night, the Dragonpit dreamed of fields and woke to chains. Keepers combed ash out of manes and told themselves they were gentling thunder. Children pressed faces to rail and asked if the monsters were sad. Nobody answered with the truth. Some men met in rooms not built for meeting and wrote their names beside words like deliverance and cleansing and future. And in those rooms the air smelled like hot iron and the moment before a match takes. The queen on the black throne answered petitions with a voice that learned how to be two things at once, mercy and arithmetic. She stood a little longer each day at windows that looked toward the sea, because the sea does not lie. It is honest about devouring. Letters reached her like birds exhausted by a storm, and she cupped each one, warmed it, and read losses aloud until they sounded like orders. She slept when sleep overpowered her like a cousin insisting on a dance. She woke with the taste of smoke's memory in her mouth. On mornings when fog folded the bay into a secret, she walked the outer parapets and spoke to Stone. Stone, being mannerly, listened. The council learned each other's throats by the way arguments rasped there. They made lists longer than afternoons. They drew arrows on maps and pretended arrows are obedient. They ate bread that had become important and drank wine that had become law. Outside, market still haggled, because haggling is a religion without a god. A baker burned his first batch, thinking of a boy he'd seen dive into a cistern to save a dog. A fishwife laughed so hard at a joke that she forgave a copper. A pickpocket returned a purse to the wrong man and started a love story with an apology. Even as dragons taught the sky new meanings, the city's heart kept beating, quietly rude, but the balance kept leaning. Soldiers in green-polished buckles, that were beginning to look like targets. Messengers in black wore their legs down to the knee. On the docks, ropes made a choir of creaks. One morning, the wind changed its mind about the direction of holiness. The crowd swelled like a sea that had dreamed of cliffs and now discovered them in stone. They came with songs and then forgot to sing. They came with prayers and then learned a different posture for their hands. They came with anger that could be molded like bread dough and baked into anything. The first gate tested its hinges. The second gate remembered the day it was hung and how proud the carpenter had been. The third gate learned the names of men who had never touched iron before and discovered it could not forget them. At the pit, chains trembled, and keepers made their mouths say calmness, while their eyes did arithmetic they had not been taught. A boy threw a stone because he needed to, and because there was a stone. Other stones had opinions about sequence. A prayer turned into a scream without ever taking a breath. The dragons felt the surge of hunger from the crowd and mistook it for something familiar. They answered with fear that looked like rage and with rage that looked like weather. The dome became a lesson in gravity, repeated loudly. Fire ran out the doors as if late to a wedding. People who had wanted to be brave discovered the difference between bravery and proximity. People who had wanted vengeance discovered how it tastes with mortar dust in it. When it was done, the city stood panting, looking at its hands, astonished by their talent for ruin. The queen listened to the news, and Age walked in and sat down beside her and did not leave. On the day after a day like that, the sun still rises. This is one of the cruelties of time and one of its mercies. The harbor woke to gulls arguing over nothing. Fishermen checked nets that had begun to resemble prayers. Children kicked at burnt straw as if it might kick back. Men with seals on their rings discussed moving grain. Women with ash in their hair carried water, as if it were an answer worth repeating. The ravens kept their appointments with distances. In the riverlands, reeds whispered to each other about hoofbeats. At Winterfell, a quiet satisfied itself that vows had not been wasted. On Dragonstone, a woman counted dragons the way a widow counts coins. She knew the numbers better than anyone, and hated them for being correct. She called for riders whose hands did not shake, and for ships that would go where maps smudged. She sent words to men who had once courted summer, and now listened to winter at night for comfort. She reminded herself that one can love a realm and still deny it what it asks for. She laid a hand on black stone that had been fire and asked it to remember. It did. In the keep below, a child laughed at a raven who clicked its beak like a joke. In a tower above, a hand trembled over a seal and then firmed. In the yard, a squire practiced a bow that would never matter, and yet the grace in it belonged to the same universe as everything else. Men in green spoke of order as if the word were a bridge that could hold armies. Men in black spoke of honor as if the word were iron that never rusts. Both were wrong, and both were right. Night returned with its bag of stars and scattered them over roofs that had learned to flinch. Sleep came on soft feet where it could, and where it could not. It curled up on thresholds and waited. Somewhere in the world, a midwife lifted a new cry into the air and laughed because it was perfect. Somewhere else, a man set down a sword he had carried too long and cried because his hands felt like strangers without it. Somewhere else, a girl woke from a dream of a field in summer, and the dream left a taste of honey that lasted until noon. On the shores of the god's eye, water hid its secret and did not speak. In the black keep on the island, the candles were tired, and yet they stood their posts. Small, loyal fires that do not know the scale of the room they serve. Maps slept in their frames, pleased to be consulted, ignorant of how little they control. Breath by breath, the realm learned its new rhythm, a slow measure of loss and resolve, of ash sifted into mortar, of names etched into the inside of the skull where there is no weather to wear them down. Mothers counted, fathers repaired. Children watched the sky the way sailors watch it, suspicious, respectful, resentful, in love. Day by day, the war stopped pretending it was a quarrel among cousins, and admitted it was a curriculum for the whole world. The lessons were expensive and compulsory. Tiny mercies still appeared like birds landing on windowsills. A hot stone slipped into a poor man's bed. A stolen apple returned to a child's hand with a wink. A guard who looked away at the right moment, because mercy is an old habit his mother had taught him with soup. These things did not change the war. They changed the people losing it. The dance did not yet have its famous ending. It had a middle like a forest, dark, full of noises, with light at the edges you might be imagining. In that middle, the Red Queen wrote herself thinner each week. In that middle, the Green King learned he could break in several directions at once and still be called whole by those who needed him to be. In that middle, dragons counted their riders and riders counted their courage, and both came up short and flew anyway. In that middle, a city began to dream of being ordinary again and could not remember the recipe. And still the sea moved in and out as if rehearsing calm for the rest of us. And still the wind combed the hair of wheat and whispered resignation in the same accent as acceptance. And still at night, if you stood in certain courtyards and held your breath, you could hear something like a heartbeat under the stone, a patient, ancient thrum that belonged not to kings or queens, but to the land itself. It had seen worse. It had survived better. It took the smoke into its lungs and let it out slowly. The realm slept lightly, woke often, and waited for whatever the next wing beat would mean. The mothers taught lullabies whose words had been edited by grief and still managed to soothe. The fathers kept watch over doors, over dreams, over the last coins, over the lies they told themselves so they could sleep. The children dreamed of riding, even those who did not want dragons, because hunger for sky is a language the young learn without effort. High above, where cold finds its truest form, stars wrote the same old reminders across a black page, that even fire is small from a distance, that empires are campfires, that love is a bright, disobedient thing that hides in alleys and palaces with equal skill, that loss is a tax and not a punishment, that tomorrow comes, morning will come, wings will rise, names will be spoken, some with tears and some with steel. Bread will be broken by hands that tremble. Crows will laugh at things only crows understand. And somewhere on a parapet, a queen will look toward a horizon that has not yet made up its mind. And she will square her shoulders against the wind. And she will breathe once, twice, and then again. And the day will take her breath as its cue. The throne waited like an old animal that knows its own weight and the soft ache it brings to any spine that dares to sit. She came to it with ash in her lungs and salt on her mouth, and the hall breathed the way a sea breathes before a storm. Iron did not bow, it accepted. The chair that had tasted 100 oaths drank another and remembered all the others, because iron keeps lists better than men do. Her hands were steady, but the steadiness cost sleep she had not yet paid back. Names lined up like ships in a fog, and each name had a harbor of wants hidden behind it. She spoke as if words could mend torn sailcloth and turn a gnawing wind into a breeze you could love again. Decrees stitched themselves across the city like rough sutures on a wound that refuses to close, while the patient insists on dancing. Some stitches held, most bled a little, and then bled more. In markets where the smell of fish used to pretend it could conquer everything, prices grew teeth and bit through pockets. In bakeries, the first loaves went to soldiers who had learned to be polite as long as they were first. In the streets, rumors ran much faster than patrols. The city kept eating and the city kept starving. Both can be true when the mouth is bigger than the pantry. At night, lamps made halos out of smoke and showed everyone their own breath drifting ahead of them, like the ghost of decisions they would make tomorrow. She met with men whose rings clicked like arguments when they folded their hands. She met with women whose eyes had learned the arithmetic of scarcity long before anyone called it policy. The island sent letters that smelled of brine and old fire and asked how long the heart could beat at this new speed. She answered by counting ships and riders and debts and hours, and the numbers sounded brave until dawn. Across the bay, currents braided themselves in a place sailors called the gullet, because that is where hunger swallows ships. Into that throat came banners and oaths and iron that knew only forward. A fleet like a riddle unfolded its masts and let the wind do the explaining. On decks where salt kissed everything into honesty, boys who had been told they were men gripped wet wood and tried to hold still the way statues do. Above them, dragons tested the grammar of the storm. One of the sea's many treaties is this: when fire meets water, steam will do the screaming. The screaming began at sunrise. Arrows invented themselves in black numbers that blotted important pieces of sky. Masts learned how to kneel in a hurry. Net galleys bit each other like dogs with a history. Spice Town burned until it forgot its name. The smoke climbed the morning like a ladder no one would survive. He rode into it because he had been taught that courage is a compass that points only one direction when the map is on fire. Vermax carried him as if the air were a road that belonged to them. Below, the enemy wrote geometry with oars and iron. A bolt found the part of history that bleeds. Another found it again, because lessons rarely arrive alone. The dragon shrieked a word older than men and tried to land on something that wasn't moving. Nothing obliged. Water welcomed flame with the complicated courtesy of an old rival. He fell like a vow losing its grip. The sea took him without comment. The sea never explains. When the news returned to the island, it did not use the door. A mother learned once more that the heart can break on the same edge again and still look whole when you light a candle behind it. A brother learned how guilt can be a lifelong companion that never stops offering advice. The realm, which had been walking a narrow beam with arms outstretched, wobbled and refused to fall. Yet, ships came ashore with stories that tried to be sentences and only managed knives. In the capital, bread became a rumor. The price of a crust could measure the distance between neighbor and enemy. A preacher found his voice the way flint finds fire, in friction and in need. He called dragons demons because that word knows how to gather a crowd. He called queens blasphemies and kings cowardice, and the poor a holy army that had at last remembered its weapons. Cobbler's Square became a throat that would not swallow. People brought their fear and their hunger and put them on the ground between their feet like children they could not carry anymore. They told themselves that they were at prayer when they were at war, and the difference in truth is mostly lighting. In the Red Keep, the soft shoes of courtiers tried to sound like authority and failed. The queen watched from windows that made the city look manageable in rectangles. She signed papers that asked miracles to report for duty. She sent out boats with flags that meant relief, and the river delivered them to crowds that did not know how to share. Food became an argument no sentence could win. Fists became punctuation. The harbor learned how to scream in many voices at once. Some were grateful, some were greedy, most were afraid. None of them were wrong. Night fell and did not fix anything. The next morning arrived with the same shabby smile. Bells tried to herd people into order and only made the chaos ring in time. She sat the throne and felt iron grow heavier with every petition that began with "my children." She hated that petition and loved it, and the love made ruling harder. Council pressed in from every side like walls that have opinions. Open the gates, close the markets, hang the thieves, free the thieves, feed the septs, break the septs, burn the sermons, kneel in the sermons, call the lords, ignore the lords, save the dragons, hide the dragons, use the dragons, deny the dragons. Every answer carried its own famine. Sleep abandoned her like a diplomat offended by the truth. She walked at night, so the walls could absorb what she could not say aloud. In the courtyards, the stones remembered rain and pretended not to remember blood. The dragon keepers combed ash from manes and spoke to their charges in voices that had learned gentleness where the world had not. Chains rattled like anxious prayers. Some dragons pined for sky, and paced until sparks stitched and unstitched the dark. Some dragons slept with one eye, the way old men sleep in cities that write history faster than they can read it. The boy she loved wanted to ride out and protect the very bones of wonder that had made this city a story in the first place. She told him no because love is sometimes the exact shape of refusal. He found another door because all children do when the house burns. He loosened her dragon because grief had taught him that flame is a friend if you are careful enough and bad at measuring. The city looked up and watched a prince rise on a creature the size of a memory of God. People cheered because it felt good to lift sound into the air. Hooks and spears and ropes and courage, with hunger sewn inside it, gathered at the hill they blamed for their days. A dome that had been a temple to power's bedtime stood against the sky like a dare. The shepherd raised his staff and turned prayer into a weapon. There are nights when a city remembers the animal it used to be. This was one. They flooded the hill with hands that had washed only in tears. They sang in a key that insults mercy. They broke doors that had always known they would be broken. Inside, the caretakers of thunder tried to be boulders and found they were men. They died like boulders would have preferred. Hard, heavy, without moving, in service to something larger than themselves. Chains burst and clattered like applause for a terrible play. No one could leave. Dragons roared pain into echo, and echo brought it back larger. The first that died was a child among giants, all teeth and promise, taught too soon what crowds can become when stories eat their owners. Another went down screaming a blue note that will never stop humming in the stones of that hill. A third thrashed and painted the air with fire until fire found its own end in smoke. Dreamfire rose like a memory that refuses to believe in endings. For a breath it looked as if age would survive youth's mistake. But roofs have their own ambition. The dome learned how to fall on the exact thing it had been built to honor. Pillars cracked, chains whiplashed, people and beasts and prayers all tumbled into the same red sentence. When the dust took a breath, there was less sky. And still the city shouted because momentum is a beast that doesn't know it is dead until morning. She heard it from the hill that thinks itself the only hill, and the crown felt suddenly like a question with no honest answer. She ran toward the sound because a mother runs toward fire if her name is written in it. Syrax came as if answering a note only she could hear. The dragon's gold lit the alley walls like a better future no one could afford. They met the mob together, rider and mount, and for a heartbeat the world remembered how to be astonished. Hooks caught light and then scale. Ladders rose, a forest of insistence. Arrows came black and then red. Syrax killed and killed until killing had no meaning left, and then the weight of the city pressed the last breath out of wonder. The dragon fell into cobbles that had never looked so small. The prince who had tried to be a hero because heroes are what boys are told to be fell from a height that never intended to let him return. A mother found a new way to break. It would have been enough to unmake a gentler world. This one kept going. Flame ran through streets like a rumor skipping steps. The sept bells rang, and then didn't, as if uncertain whether heaven wanted minutes marked in this hour. The river tried to put its hands on everything hot and failed, because sometimes even water is late. By midnight, the city stank of metal and prayer, and the particular sweetness of things that should not have burned. The shepherd lifted his staff again, and the city knelt, because the city had finally found a god who sounded like them. Sleep left the capital for the countryside, and did not write. At dawn, ash lay over roofs like a new snow that had forgotten how to comfort. The hill smoked and did not apologize. The queen sat the throne that morning with eyes that had seen the inside of a furnace and the tender way embers go out when they run out of names. Petitions came like waves and rolled back bloodier. She signed mercy until mercy bruised. She signed wrath until wrath felt nothing. The chair did not care. It had developed immunity long ago. Some lords slipped away under the excuse of prayer and washed their faces in the river because the river will listen without arguing. Some soldiers stared at their hands, counting who they had been yesterday and who they found there now. Some children discovered there are days when play cannot be invented out of the broken. By noon, the markets had decided to pretend they were normal, because pretending is a kind of bread. By evening, a cold wind pushed smoke out of the streets and into the sky, where it smeared the stars into a soft lie. She climbed to a tower where the air still felt honest and let herself be smaller than the day. The city murmured below like an animal too tired to growl. She closed her eyes and saw the dome falling again, and beneath it, a century bowing. She opened them and saw gulls arguing over something not worth the noise. She smiled because life insists. She cried because life insists. When she returned to the hall, the throne waited with the patience of a rock in a river. She stood before it and let her breath become a metronome. She thought of the first time she had traced her finger along the carved table on the island and felt the world's bones beneath lacquer and paint. She thought of children asleep in rooms that might not survive their dreams. She thought of grain in ships and mouths in alleys, and the way love makes knives merciful and crowns heavier. She thought of the dragons, those that had died, those that limped, those that listened for footsteps that would never return. Perhaps a city without dragons is a city that can sleep again. Perhaps a city without dragons is a city that forgets how to be awake. She could not decide which mercy was crueler. In the distance, the river kept repeating itself, gentle and relentless, like a nurse humming to a fever. The wind changed and brought her the smell of salt and promise and failure and tomorrow. She listened until the smell became a thought, and the thought a decision, and the decision a door. Beyond that door waited more maps and more prayers, and the memory of a dome falling like a sentence that will take generations to finish saying. She walked through, and the hall swallowed her like a history does when it has fallen in love with one voice and will not let her go. Outside, the city practiced being alive. A boy stole an apple and split it with a girl who had threatened to shout. A woman with ash in her hair laughed so hard at a joke that a stranger bought her bread. A guard took off his helmet to scratch his head and realized he was crying. He left the helmet off. A dog found a bone and decided not to ask questions. The shepherd counted his listeners and dreamed of larger numbers. The dragon keepers counted losses and dreamed of eggs. The bakers counted coppers and dreamed of flour. The queen counted breaths and dreamed of sleep. Night came again, with fewer stars. The smoke had taught the sky to keep secrets. Somewhere on the water, a ship pretended to be a bed and fooled a man into rest. Somewhere in a tower, a single candle argued with a map and won for a while. Somewhere in the pit's ruins, a child picked up a flake of scale and decided to keep it because it was pretty and because some part of the world should be allowed to stay simple. Somewhere in the palace, a mother adjusted a blanket and whispered a song that had outlived 10 regimes. The throne waited, patient as a biography, certain that whoever sat tomorrow would bring new names for the same old pains. And the city turned over in its sleep, clutching its scars like a talisman, listening for wings that would not come, and for hoofbeats that would, and found, for one moment, a thin seam of quiet, a breath of almost peace, a promise that morning, even this morning, would arrive. It would not apologize. It would not explain. It would simply bring light to the rooms where choices are made, and in that light everything would look for a heartbeat, smaller and manageable, until the heartbeat passed, and the work of grief and bread and law began again, and the hills smoked, and the river repeated, and somewhere far off, over water that still remembers dragons, a gull laughed at a scrap of fish as if laughter were easy, and perhaps for the gull it was. For the rest, it would have to be enough that breath still came and went, that the world still rotated underfoot, that even ashes can be warm, that even thrones can be stood from, that even sleep, when it finally arrives, can carry a woman like a ship carries a city's hope, fragile and stubborn and afloat in a night that will one day learn the name Dawn again. The boy who made a pact with an ancient roar rode without music, and the rivers learned his schedule by ash. Villages woke to hoofbeats that arrived like verdicts. Doors remembered how to hold their breath. Smoke rolled over barley and spelled a name the wind already knew, and the name meant a blue eye set in iron and a dragon older than most kinds of fear. He spoke little because vengeance needs room in the mouth. He measured distance in roofs undone and bridges that learned to say never again. Roadside shrines turned their faces to the hedge. Mothers counted to numbers that didn't help and kept counting anyway. Where he passed, wells tasted of coin and cinder. Where he turned, children learned how to recognize horizon as a warning. He called this order because maps prefer straight lines. The river called it weather and kept moving. Harrenhal rose up out of the mist like a sermon half burned and still intent on saving someone. He found a chair in that ruin, and it fit his mood. Walls with memories of hotter lightning welcomed him with the cruelty of indifference. He slept beneath stones that had been punished already and dreamed of finishing a sentence someone else began. Across marsh and ford, another rider laughed at doom as if it were an old friend with a good story and worse timing. He came to the same black castle and taught the bats a new name for quiet. He walked rooms where ash had settled into patterns like charred lace. He traced them, reading prophecies written by heat. He wrote 2 words and sent them south and north, not to be read but to be obeyed. Come alone. Between the 2 of them, a lake held a polished face up like a mirror offering flattery. They both ignored flattery and accepted the invitation to honesty on roads that have forgotten how to be kind. Ravens stitched a message from one sky to another, and men on both banks of the God's Eye began to speak in softer voices, the way people do in temples and before storms. A mill burned because both sides needed a story about grain. The fish remembered blood because fish always do. The reeds learned a new word for trampled and promised to teach it to their children. The small songs of the riverlands, frog, cricket, bucket, rope, were pushed to the corners, while larger music rehearsed. In King's Landing, the wind shifted and brought the smell of wet wood and far fires. The city understood that what happens on a lake can drown a crown in a dry hall. The shepherd counted listeners as if counting begat salvation. The baker counted coppers as if coppers begat bread. The queen counted breaths and learned each one by heart. Even the Red Keep cocked its ears toward the east, the way a cat pretends not to listen and hears everything. He rode from Harrenhal when moonlight made the ruined towers look thoughtful. Old stones muttered blessings in the language of weight. She did not sleep that night, the woman who had chosen to sit where oaths turned to iron. She stood at a window that held the city inside its frame like a painting, and she asked the air for a smaller morning. The air, democratic to a fault, made no promises. At dawn, the lake lay flat as the palm of a god, uninterested in clapping. Swans moved like clean thoughts. A fisherman lied about yesterday's catch to no one in particular. Then the first wing beat rewrote the page. Vagar came over the trees like a cathedral deciding to walk. The water remembered 100 years of men being small and wrote it brighter. Caraxes answered, red, sinuous, a line of anger sketched by an artist who never learned to erase. 2 shadows scaled the day, and the day failed to object. On the shore, men watched from behind spears, the way rabbits watch thunderheads. They did not pray aloud because some spectacles ask for mouths to be quiet. High above, certainties collided. Claw found scale the way a hand finds a door in the dark. Tooth learned bone is still bone even after it becomes a myth. Wing tore sky, and the sky made no complaint. He leaned into the red neck the way a man leans into a final decision. The other leaned into age as if time could be harnessed by force of will. For a heartbeat, the lake saw both riders clearly. The smile that had been sharpened into an oath, the sapphire that had been sharpened into a stare, and then spray concealed their faces with a bridal veil of cold. They rose and fell and rose again until the horizon forgot which way was home. Vhagar's voice rolled over the hills and sheep miscarried. Caraxes' hiss painted an accent on the wind, and men remembered sins they had liked at the time. They struck like storms arriving at the same harbor. They parted like ships who know that they will return to the same wreck. Below, the god's eye kept impeccable books. Every spark entered, every shadow was noted. When the red serpent locked its body around the elder mountain of a dragon, water leapt up as if to pull them both down to its preferred jurisdiction. Steel mattered for the length of 2 breaths. Then only gravity mattered, and gravity is the quietest killer. They plummeted in a braid of ruin. Caraxes hit the lake like a fallen standard, and then bleeding music crawled toward shore, red writing its signature in the shallows. Vhagar went deeper, heavy with centuries, into a dark that knows how to keep important things. The ripples widened like news. Men on both banks lifted their hands without meaning prayer, and then did not lower them for a long time. Somewhere in a tower, the queen felt a cord snap inside a map no one else could see. Somewhere in a ruin, a smile became a story. Somewhere in a city, a preacher's voice grew 2 sizes too big for mercy. On the lakeshore, reeds bowed to no one, and the day resumed, ashamed of its interruption. A wind passed, and the smell of old iron left with it. The swans returned as if apologizing for having briefly understood fear. By nightfall, even soldiers spoke softly, as if their mouths were full of someone else's names. In the capital, people chose different versions of the same telling. Some said it meant 1 crown now, some said it meant none for a while, some said it meant the world had stopped aging and would wake tomorrow younger. The throne had opinions it did not share. The shepherd added the tale to his liturgy. He made the lake a witness and turned Dragonbane into a parable about pride. The crowd found it easy to believe because hunger always believes the worst about feasts. On the island, black stone kept its own counsel. Torches painted the carved table with flicker, and the carved rivers with light that pretended to be water. Men and women moved markers over wood, as if markers ever obey. A raven banged its beak against a shutter until the steward's hand learned urgency. The letter said loss in 3 sentences and then said winter in 1. She read it twice and did not blink. Blinking is for luxuries and privacy, and she had neither. She dismissed the room that loved her and sat with a room that did not care. Night, stone, waves, the hour after news. When she rose again, she carried the weight as if the weight were a child that might sleep if rocked correctly. She rocked in her walk, and the room swayed and found a new stillness around her. Up the river, barns filled with refugees pretended to be churches. Down the river, churches learned how to be barns. Everywhere, fires learned restraint at last and settled into coals, which is where most of history lives. A road where he had passed grew grass again. A ford where he had laughed at danger forgot his accent. A village that had hidden its daughters took them to the stream, as if water could remember innocence and lend some. Harrenhal played host to owls and conspiracies. The walls listened and stored as they always do. The courtyard forgot banners and remembered weight. Men spoke of succession as if it were a herb you could steep properly to calm a fever. They found the brew bitter and kept sipping because it was all the cupboard had. The fisher who found red scales on the reeds sold them to a peddler, who sold them to a lord who nailed them to a memory. Everyone involved called it piety, and no one was wrong. Back in the city, the hill still smoked where it had learned the taste of dragons. Children played among black stones because children always make games out of what they are given. Their laughter sounded like bells with coughs. The shepherd walked through markets like a knife wrapped in scripture. He told bread to rise without ovens and asked water to become pure without wells. When neither obeyed, he blamed the crown and the creatures that had made this place famous. The queen held council, and the council held its breath. They argued famine with spears and riot with parchment. She called for grain from places that had never loved the city, and for patience from a people who had stripped patience for kindling. It rained once, and men raised their faces and let themselves pretend the sky had chosen them again. It rained twice, and the gutters remembered movement. It rained a third time, and the mud became a language anyone could learn. Riders in green carried orders shaped like hope to captains shaped like caution. Riders in black carried comfort to widows who wanted bread more than news. Both kinds of riders drank the same cheap ale and lied the same small lies to sleep. In a tower, he was missing and present both. In a ruin, he was story and state. Over the lake, he was rumor and fishbone. The red dragon's carcass rotted with dignity. The old Queen of Fires was a rumor in the mud, a giant lost ring. Boys dared each other to swim where the water felt colder and said they felt a heartbeat. It was their own. A cart creaked out of the riverlands carrying sacks that once were wheat and now were ballast. The woman driving it had seen more sunsets than kings. She clucked her tongue at a lame mule and told it she understood. At a crossroads inn, men shouted about justice until the ale ran low, and then found quieter synonyms. In the stable, a boy slept under a horse, and the horse slept above him, and the two of them dreamed of open fields where names are not currency. On a narrow stair in the keep, a serving girl paused to breathe and discovered she had not stopped since the morning Targaryens learned how fragile air can be. She laughed and then cried and then laughed because both felt like betrayal, and she was tired of being loyal. In the harbor, ropes cracked like whips with no grudges. A gull stole a fish from a gull who had stolen it from a man. The men laughed because what else can you do when the gods explain themselves so clearly? Night came down softer than it had in weeks, as if exhaustion had taught even darkness manners. Torches made islands of trust. Dogs curled into commas. Guards discovered their shoulders and lowered them 1 degree. On the wall above the gate, a sentry sang to himself about a girl he had never met. Below him, a cat stalked a mouse with a patience that kings would envy. Above him, stars rehearsed old lines and got them right. At the sept, the shepherd's candles dripped and hissed and made lace. Beside him, a boy held a staff too big for his height and tried to look like fury and only achieved fervor. Behind them, the statue of the mother looked down and remembered the day she had been lifted into place and how the workmen had whistled. Somewhere else in the city, a quiet room welcomed a man with a cup that was not poisoned and a robe that did not itch. He breathed like someone inventing it. He dreamed of summer before it learned about strategy. She, the woman who still wore the heaviest thing, sat at a table and moved a marker to a place beside water and wrote a word that meant meeting and fate and please. She sealed the raven's leg to the sentence and sent it into a sky that owed her nothing and would deliver her anyway. Sleep came late and left early and carried, between those times, only the smallest of mercies, a blank face on which she could paint a field, a chorus of frogs that sounded like agreement, a door that did not creak, a hand on her shoulder from a memory she allowed. The god's eye lay all this while as if innocent. Dawn followed dawn the way it does when men lose track. Reeds hummed, carp rose, a boat leaked. The ferryman lied about the leak and bailed with practiced denial. On the 5th morning after the fall, a boy on the western bank found a sapphire set in a ring of dull gold and thought the lake had given him a star. He told no one and hid it in the one place even God cannot see, under his pillow. That night he dreamed of a blue fire that did not burn. On the 7th, an old knight on the eastern shore touched the red skull in the shallows and felt his own mortality make peace with his pride. He told his squire a story that left out nothing important and everything shameful. The squire learned the difference and then forgot it at the first trumpet. In King's Landing, the crowd learned how to be a jury without judges. The shepherd learned how to sentence. The city learned why gods do not dwell in domes. They burn too easily. Bread came in on carts and went out in fists. Wine came in on ships and went out in songs. Neither stayed long enough to make the difference people claimed they would. A child drew a dragon on a wall with a burnt stick, and then drew a spear through it, and then leaned her head against the stone and slept. Passers-by saw the drawing and felt brave until they saw the sleeping. Then they felt human and kept walking. By the time the leaves began to thin on the King's Road, the Riverlands had memorized the shape of mercy under hooves. The Black Castle had finished its new silence. The lake had settled into the role it had been given. Keeper of fairness, no one would accept. A raven returned to the island with a reply that wasn't in ink. It was a feather and a scent and a stain on the parchment where Water had thought about reading. She read it anyway and understood. She sent for her sons and found only the air where they had been. She lowered her head until her crown touched her knuckles, and the cold spark jumped skin to metal. She lifted it again, because lifting is the only ceremony that remains when all the other ones have failed. Down the hill, men carried stones from the ruined pit and stacked them into benches. Women sat and watched the evening and spoke of nothing and everything. A boy played a tune on a pipe and got one note right. A girl clapped once and made the note into music. The throne, which had listened to many kinds of footsteps, learned again the pace of someone who will not run. The hall, which had seen many kinds of weeping, learned again how quiet can do the same work without witnesses. In the Riverlands, soldiers leaned against trees that had learned to bend. They sharpened blades that had learned to wait. They wrote letters with words like soon and safe and home, and mailed them into a world where none of those words meant what they used to. A hermit who owned nothing but a cave and 3 opinions told a prince he had never met to stop. No one listened. The hermit slept perfectly and died in the morning, smiling. A fishwife at the ford told a joke so filthy that 5 men forgot their grief for the length of a laughter. She spat and said that was the first honest prayer she had heard all year. The men agreed and later told the joke wrong. The lake held the secret where secrets prefer, below light and above hell, and kept it properly. Divers tried and gave up. Priests tried and declared a miracle. Children threw stones and measured circles and named them crowns and stepped on them. News moved through the realm like a shadow cast by a higher fire. Wherever it fell, grass leaned and then forgot. Wherever it did not fall, men invented their own and called invention loyalty. In the capital, the shepherd's staff learned to point. The queen's pen learned to press. The people's mouths learned to chant. The guards' boots learned to pivot. The wind learned to exit alleys without taking a side. A night came when the smoke had thinned enough to see the moon. It rose the color of old bone. Someone said that was an omen. Someone else said everything is an omen if you want to be tired. A third said shut up and passed the cup. All 3 slept and woke. Before dawn, the god's eye was glass again. A fox trotted along the shore carrying a fish. Crows argued about it and lost. A man washing his shirt in the shallows dropped it and watched it float and thought of surrender and then of dry cloth and reached out and saved it and felt noble. Above him, owls finished their shift and blinked and forgave no one because owls don't. She rose again and did the work, which is the part of legend stories skip. She signed grain and gallows. She listened and measured. She refused and relented. She gave orders she hated and withheld comforts she craved. She allowed herself 1 breath of sea and 1 whisper of a name, and then put both away like knives she would not use today. In a tenement near the fish market, a young mother woke to a baby who smiled before crying. She cried anyway with gratitude, and then laughed because the smile had been enough to make the day survivable. She told the baby a story about two dragons who went to sleep beneath a lake and would wake one day and be smaller. The baby slept through the ending and thus learned mercy. A cobbler sewed new soles onto old boots and told his apprentice every job is resurrection. The apprentice believed him for an hour and then went outside and kicked a stone and swore and believed him again. On the lakeshore, a man found a scale as big as a platter, green at the edges with age, and sold it for less than it was worth, which is the only price worth paying for relics. The buyer hung it in his hall and told guests it sang in storms. It didn't. He sang instead, and everyone preferred that. Evening took the city gently by the chin and turned its face toward the west, where the sky sprained itself with color. People stopped and stared and remembered for a minute that beauty still keeps an apartment here. Then the color left and the rent came due. In the Red Keep, a page spilled ink and the stain looked like a dragon. He apologized to the scribe and the scribe said, "Leave it. It's a good omen." The page asked if omens had not done enough. The scribe kept writing because writing is a way to beg the future to include you. The dance shifted its weight from one foot to the other and kept time with the heartbeats of those who remained. In the Riverlands, the wind learned a new tune and hummed it through arrow slits. On the God's Eye, the secret warmed a fraction of a degree and then cooled again. In the city, the shepherd climbed a step he hadn't earned. On the island, a candle guttered and recovered. Somewhere between the two truths, dragons fell, people stayed. Someone made supper and someone made love, and someone made a plan, and someone made a mistake, and someone made a promise he would later break. The world recorded none of it, and all of it in the same ink. At last night closed the ledger and laid it face down. Dreams came in wearing masks borrowed from memory. One dream took the queen to a lake at dawn, where nothing hurt, and the water gave back every face she loved. She woke, and the room was ordinary. And thus, dear, she rose because morning had asked politely. The city stretched its scars and got to its feet. The river breathed. The lake kept counsel. The road gave itself to hooves without complaint. Somewhere a bell rang for matins, and somewhere a child laughed at nothing. The sound met halfway with the bell and made a chord that was almost peace. It would have to do. They went looking for riders in places where names are spoken softly and soup is ladled by hands that remember winter. Caves breathed old heat. Dragons blinked like banked coals deciding whether to glow. Men with salt in their hair and boys with ash on their sleeves stood before mouths that could end them and said please in the language of stillness. A black island called to Sparks sleeping in low-born bones, and Sparks, being honest, lifted their heads. A girl who had learned hunger's manners brought sheep to a temper she treated like weather. The dragon came down like the end of a sentence and found a kindness it could trust. They began to call her by a name that sounded like nettles in the wind, a sound with sting and music. A boy of Hull touched gray-green scale and felt harbor water climb his spine. Sea smoke tasted his courage and allowed the taste. Two drinkers with the breath of barrels and the hearts of bells found themselves before giants older than sermons. Vermithor lowered his jaw. Silverwing considered and agreed. The keepers watched like midwives, terrified and proud. The queen on the island counted riders with the tenderness of someone counting breaths in a sick room. Her letters set out to the riverlands and the marches, and the long shore like lanterns let loose on black water. Word went ahead of them, a rumor dressed in usefulness, and men who'd never been asked anything larger than loyalty found the sky opening like a door with their name on it. Saddles creaked over ancient spines. New hands learned old handles. No one pretended dragons could be owned. At best, they could be accompanied. Night found the caves warm again. Morning found the courtyards full of shadows. that moved as if remembering dawns from another century. On Driftmark, the salt wind carried a question to a boy who had been given a name with ships in it. Adam answered by standing where his father had not, in light that didn't flatter, before a dragon that mistrusted most of the world. Seasmoke nodded like a veteran, recognizing a soldier who had yet to be wounded. Across waters made of memory and commerce, banners gathered at Tumbleton, a town that smelled of broth and ambition, a crossroads that had learned it could be bought before it learned it could be loved. The first armies arrived with drums and the second with accountants. The third arrived with dragons. Innkeepers counted coin and then casualties. Children counted wings and then fires. Lines were drawn with heels and then hoofbeats. At the hour when the sun doubts itself, Vermithor rose like a mountain that had remembered its legs. Silverwing followed like a widow who still knows the steps. Tessarian's blue fire stitched the air with bright questions, and Seasmoke cut the field in white breath like chalk on slate. The town learned how sound can bruise. From roofs and hedgerows, men saw oaths about to break and prayed to be elsewhere when they did. Hugh Hammer, who had learned the weight of a hammer before the weight of a crown, weighed both at once and chose the coin that rings loudest. Ulf White smiled the way men smile when thirst meets river. They turned their dragons like arguments that change their conclusion mid-sentence and make the last word expensive. Vermithor roared, but to whom? Silverwing wheeled, but for whom? The ground answered in bodies and banners turned on their poles. Adam felt betrayal like a wind he could not tack against, and did not flee. Seasmoke wrote a white line through the worst of it and came back smoking. Tumbleton became a theorem about flames and fences. The first battle ended with bread baked in ash, with walls blacked and names smudged. Worse than loss is doubt. It stains longer across the realm. Men repeating the story tucked the treason neatly into the middle, as if it explained everything and therefore nothing. Ravens carried two kinds of ink, one that told where the treacherous slept, and one that did not say sleep at all. On the island, the queen received it all with a face that refused to be a theater. She sent another message into the mountains of the moon, soft and sharp. And the message was this: not all love survives war, and not all orders deserve obedience. Demon read it beside a fire, and understood how cold the dawn would be. Before the gods were woken, before the knives quickened, he found a girl and a dragon that trusted her because she had fed it with her own hands. He told her to fly where no map can lie. He touched her cheek with the kind of gentleness that makes bravery look easy. She climbed the ragged ladder of sheep-stealers' back and left the world that had begun to understand her too late. The mountains opened to her like a mouth that had decided not to bite. Goats rang their bells. Snow braided itself into her hair. The dragon chose caves that remembered lava and listened to the old hush. No chronicler followed. Some endings keep themselves. Back at Tumbleton, the victorious discovered the appetite of victory. It eats discipline first. Wine replaced watchmen. Hugh and Ulf warmed their hands at stranger fires and called the heat their own. The town fattened on stolen wagons and thin promises. People who had learned to move softly began to step loudly. Under banners that bragged with borrowed paint, men forgot which way their oaths faced. Adam did not forget. The sea had taught him the difference between a squall and a storm line, and he saw the latter standing still over the town. He flew to the queen and asked to be forgiven for what he must do. She looked at him as a mother looks at a son who will not be allowed to age, and nodded the nod that grants men permission to be exactly who they are. He turned Seasmoke toward the sleeping treason and chose dawn. At the same hour, Tessarian blinked awake in blue. Vermithor stretched a jaw that had once chewed kings. Silverwing lifted a tired, loyal gaze. The second Tumbleton rose. This time, there were fewer speeches and more decisions. Adam struck not at banners, but at throats. Fire made alleys into arguments. Targaryen blue chased white, then red chased blue, then everything turned the color of a forge's breath. Vermithor, ageless law, and Silverwing, faithful widow, learned how even the old can be surprised by the young. In that confusion, men remembered how easy it is to become smoke. Hugh Hammer died like a bell missing the hour. Even the ground seemed reluctant to accept him. Ulf White drank his last and found it not enough. Targaryen and Vermithor came down fighting and did not agree on how to rest. Silverwing circled the wreck like a memory searching for where to land. Adam and Seasmoke held the field long enough to instruct a legend and then fell into it. When the doors of morning opened properly, Tumbleton smelled of sour wine and cooked iron, and the bitter of triumph that cost itself. Somewhere a baker saved his starter and told his daughter that bread is stubborn. This is why we survive. The message leapt from town to castle to island and wrote itself as a eulogy and an accounting entry. The Queen's hand, already accustomed to loss, tightened and released like a lung. In King's Landing, grief curdled into a quiet that made the sept feel like a hollow tooth. Helaena walked rooms that had been designed for joy and could not remember why. She measured windows with her eyes and found nothing inside them worth the distance. Her children's names lived in her mouth as thorns live in hedges. Once she had loved moths. Now even their powder felt like a verdict. People spoke to her in voices wrapped in cotton. They told her of piety and patience and the common future. They did not tell her where to set her sorrow down. One afternoon, the city sounded like itself again. Barrels rolled, vendors counted coppers twice, gulls plotted, yet none of it reached her. She moved as if hope were a garment she had outgrown, and was polite enough not to tear. She crossed a room no one else could see and stepped across an edge only grief measures. Afterward, the bells argued about whether to toll fast or slow. Mothers held children tighter and wondered if love is a bridge or a rope. The shepherd preached that dragons had eaten her and found the crowd easy. In the Red Keep, a king who was not ready for love or rule or pity broke again where he had just been mended. King's Landing fell asleep that night with more locks and fewer lanterns. The queen on the black throne received the news as if it had always belonged to her desk. She put it beside other cruel errands the world had assigned her. A child came to her chambers and asked if the city would ever be kind. She said yes, because some lies are planting seasons, but the city unplanted remembered the day the Dragonpit collapsed into its own fire and answered the queen with smoke and whispers. Her enemies called her kinslayer and tyrant. Her friends called her necessary and winter maid. She kept breathing. When the bakeries closed for lack of flour, and the fishmongers sold bones with the same grave nods as fillets, the hill learned to hate anyone with a crest. The queen heard the new chant long before it reached her gates. The chant did not ask. It concluded. She left the capital like a ship leaving a harbor that has learned to hate ships, quietly and at night, with too few oars and a wind that argued. She sold a crown once wrapped in history to men who had carefully unlearned reverence. Gold clinked without ceremony. The sea, never impressed, asked where she wanted the waves to carry her sorrow. She chose Dragonstone because grief is a compass pointing home, even when home has changed its furniture and learned new names for knives. The garrison that should have gathered like sons gathered like counters. Loyalty practiced its smile in mirrors and came to the door wearing treason's clothes. Inside the gate, a trap tried to be a welcome. Sunfire waited in a broken glory that still dazzled because pride does not know how to dim. Aegon, unsteadily sovereign, wore pain like armor that creaks. He did not look like a king, and he did not intend to. He looked like retribution, and that was enough. They forced her to stand before the beast that had burned better men and worse. She did not ask for mercy, because mercy is a language the present had forgotten. She asked only that her son be spared the sight. The request crossed the air, and landed nowhere. The dragon fed as dragons do when men arrange vengeance for them. The boy watched and learned what it costs to be loved by history. Afterward, the island went quiet the way a bell does when its tongue is cut. In King's Landing, the shepherd raised his hands and called it justice. The crowd agreed because they needed a word like that to sleep. But sleep did not come. Aegon sat his throne like a man sitting on the edge of a bed too high for his feet. He asked for wine and found it less helpful than myth suggests. He asked for counsel and found it shaped like cages. He asked for silence and received a city. He could not walk without remembering flame. He could not eat without remembering wings. He could not dream without remembering teeth. Broken is a kingdom that whistles while crossing bridges it knows are rotten. He whistled. The realm watched his lips and invented hope out of the shape of them. The queen survivors gathered what remained of the children of Ash. A boy with salt-sore eyes and a crown made of absence sailed the long way around the world to avoid the short way through it. A brother lost in far rooms of Lys learned new languages for captivity and waited for letters written on the back of waves. On decks that pitched like fever, men taught Aegon the younger names he would carry until they grew too heavy. They called him Prince because habit is a rope with knots in it. They carved him into something quiet and watchful because the sea does that to boys. At night he lay under canvas that smelled of fish and fear and the word yet. He counted masts and moons and the ways a sail can go slack. He learned the sound rope makes when it solves problems. He learned to look at the line where sky kisses water and see not romance, but arithmetic. Some days he imagined the island as it had been, full of red heat and laughter, and a table lit like a promise. Some days he imagined it exactly as it was, a place that ate his mother. Both imaginations hurt, and hurt began to feel like gravity. In the capital, the king held audiences in rooms that refused to bless him. Men knelt with their eyes up to see whether his would give anything away. They asked for grain and gold and judgment, and found each measured in the same currency, dragons that no one had. He signed pardons that pardoned hunger. He signed hangings that hanged fear. He signed treaties that promised tomorrow to mouths that were already busy with today. Behind him, tapestries of dragons flying over fields of wheat faded as if ashamed. Sometimes a song rose from the lower city, the kind sung by people who know work and remember love. He hated those songs because they were better rulers. Once, drunk and awake, he walked to a window and asked the knight if he could be forgiven before he was condemned. The knight, as always, answered by being beautiful and indifferent. He found in that answer a kind of counsel. Elsewhere, Nettles moved among mountain men who had never counted themselves until she arrived and asked them to. She taught them how to feed a furnace that had learned patience. She learned their riddles and their short winters and their long knives. She wore a cloak that smelled of wet goat and smoke and independence. She did not read the histories written about her because she was not finished writing the world. In valleys no map-maker bothered to flatter. Sheep-stealer hunted stone-colored and content. At dawn, the dragon's shadow made the ridge look like a new alphabet. In that alphabet, the words for home and mercy and later were the same. Back in Tumbleton, the ashes learned to behave and the living forced themselves to notice. Silverwing found a hill where the wind had no arguments and circled there, lonesome and dignified, as if remembering a promise no one could keep. Men pointed and said the old queen takes her walk. They did not know whether to be comforted. In the riverlands, wolves listened to thinner human music and moved closer to barns. Ravens did the same and called it administration. On the island that had eaten a queen, soldiers began to dream of the day they could say they had been elsewhere. In the Red Keep, a child drew a bird with a crown and was slapped for it. In a street where vines insisted and paint peeled, a woman told a story about a girl who fed a monster and lived. The children listening decided they liked that ending. Aegon the Younger came to court because sails cannot flee forever. He stood in a hall that had taught his blood how to sit. He bowed without making a sound. He did not look at the throne because he could not afford to see furniture as an enemy. The king studied the boy, as if searching for forgiveness inside him, like a lost coin. In a pocket, he found, instead, the exact shape of tomorrow, and it frightened him. He gave the boy a seat near his own and called it mercy. The court called it spectacle. The realm called it proof that the gods had not yet chosen between ghosts. When ships from the east finally traded letters for sons, a boy with salt in his marrow came home with a stranger's language folded into his dreams. Viserys walked like someone who'd taught his legs different streets. He smiled the way captives smile when doors remain doors. Brother and brother stood beside each other and looked at the same future and saw two different survivals. One would be a crown. One would be a shadow that made the crown's shape tolerable. The king watched them and felt the room tilt. He ordered music because music can brace a wall. The song chosen was an old one about harvest and fireside love, and the court sat there trying not to remember how few fields remained untrampled. Outside, the city was practicing forgiveness by counting its coin again. Inside, forgiveness practiced counting its victims. The dance had burned through riders and beasts and mothers and sons and sermons and oaths. Now, it burned through patience. On a morning that tried to be ordinary, a cart rolled into a courtyard with a clink of careless harness. A cup went from table to hand, from hand to mouth, and history took its sip. Men who had planned the hour nodded like gardeners eyeing a frost. Aegon II laid his broken body down into a final silence that did not ask his permission. No heralds cried it right away. No bells celebrated. The news moved like spilled wine, staining as it went, impossible to gather back into a vessel. In that spreading stain, lords looked at boys and saw kings. They looked at old enemies and saw necessities. They looked at the throne and saw a chair that might finally stop making demands for blood, louder than for wisdom. In chambers Spartan and watchful, Aegon the Younger touched metal that had ended lives and vowed to make it feel different against his palm. He could not promise peace. He could promise quiet. Courtiers who prefer fireworks to embers sighed, but they bowed. The realm exhaled with scars. Dragon keepers tended empty perches as if caring for ghosts might invite birds. Stable hands learned to pat air. Masons knocked down black domes and raised pale arches and called them a change in style. What they meant was a change in faith. Poets, shameless and necessary, turned fire into lesson and lesson into lullaby. Nettles, if she heard any of it, kept the mountain wind in her ears and slept beside a furnace that had chosen her. Silverwing still circled, landing where old kings had promised not to die. People began to tell each other that means something, though they could not agree on what. In kitchens, the price of flour argued with the price of hope, and lost or won according to the day. Mothers held their children close, then at arm's length, as if trying to memorize their faces with two different kinds of distance. Fathers looked at their hands and wondered whether they were still the right tools for holding a world. Bells practiced gentler work, measuring weddings again, counting harvest dances, forgiving their throats. Cregan in the north kept his word like a winter keeps ice. He sent breath and bread and a stern letter that hugged in the margins. The Vale looked down from its white balconies and permitted itself a nod. The riverlands, wet with memory and seed, began to push green through ash. On the island, Blackstone watched a quieter queen grow into a winter hymn. In the capital, markets laughed too loud and then just enough. At night, when roofs remember stars, a small boy with a crown sat at a window and listened to a city breathe. He counted not dragons, but chimneys. He learned the names of streets that never appear on maps because maps are for owners. He asked an old woman how to make a loaf and an old soldier when to sheath a sword. They told him the same thing in different words. Do it earlier than your pride suggests and later than your fear permits. He practiced both kinds of timing. He let the throne become a bench when children came to tell him complaints about alley kings and stolen marbles. He let it become lightning when lords came to tell him what he owed them. He He kept a fire small and steady on nights when the wind tried voices again. He walked the yard where Syrax had died and did not close his eyes. He walked the hill where sermons had sharpened and forgave stone for being stone. He walked the halls where his mother's shadow still rearranged the air and learned how to bow without breaking. A hush at last replaced the roar. Not peace, never that, not yet, but a hush big enough for harvest songs to stand upright in. Big enough for boats to argue with currents about fish rather than war. Big enough for children to name cats after kings again, which is the surest sign that kingdoms have remembered themselves. In that hush, the last embers of the dance arranged themselves into a bed of coals that could heat a future without burning it. The boy king lay awake and listened to the sea, which tells the same story every night. A story about leaving and still being there. He whispered a promise that did not include the word dragon. He held it like a candle in a chapel that had survived its own roof. He watched dawn lift over a city still learning how to be gentle to itself. He breathed, and the day took the hint. The cup was lifted the way men lift small decisions that change large things, casually, as if fingers are not witnesses. The courtyard breathed like a held note. Metal clinked because metal has no manners. He tasted the wine, and the wine tasted him back. In that exchange, a verdict introduced itself without ceremony. The cart rolled, the horses dozed, the sky kept its distance, and a king set his weight upon a bench that did not object until the body forgot how to be a throne for breath. When he folded like a tent that had survived too much wind. No bells were asked to speak yet. Silence did the heavy lifting first. Men with careful beards and the kinds of eyes that hear coins before they see them felt the news arrive in the air and chose quotable phrases for later. Women who had carried water up too many stairs felt it arrive in their shoulders and decided they would be tired in the evening instead. A hall that had rehearsed grief found the shape again and put it on without looking in a mirror. His dragon, somewhere beyond wakefulness, dreamed of a sky where pain was unclasped. The shepherd held his staff and asked whether God had an opinion. The crowd decided God agreed with them and saved everyone time. In a small room within many rooms, a boy looked at a chair like a deep river, crossable but not to be taken lightly. He did not rush. That was the first lesson he let them learn. When he came to the throne, he did not test it with bravado. He pressed his palm to the arm and let the iron measure him. It found no spectacle in him and no apology either. It found a boy who had watched history eat his mother and had decided to serve bread. He sat the way fishermen sit in the hour before dawn, quiet and sure that dawn is not impressed. Lords bent. Oaths walked out of storage and tried to stand straight. Tapestry dragons faded gently in the background, as if the room itself had learned humility. A crown that had cut other brows rested on hair not yet tired by gray, and understood it might be asked to be lighter this time. The boy king lifted his face and let the court see his refusal to raise his voice. In that refusal, the realm discovered it could exhale without cheering. They named him with old words that sound best beside a hearth. Mercy's son, Winter's student, Dragonbane, whose weapon is patience. He did not smile. He did not need to. Outside, the city tried to remember the recipe for ordinary. Bread lines untangled into markets. The laughter in alleys found its shoes. Bells risked a song that wasn't shaped like warning. On the hill where stone wore dragon soot like a tattoo, children chased one another, shouting rules only they understood. Because childhood always invents treaties after wars have proved treaties fragile. He walked there in plain cloak and stood long enough to become a rumor, and then a man among stone. He touched a shattered cornice and did not pretend to speak with ghosts. He listened to wind, because wind is fluent in aftermath. In the river's slow mirror, a city with less smoke introduced itself. Fishermen's wives returned to the pier with baskets of wriggling silver and jokes older than the dynasty. The jokes landed because the fish were fresh. On the island, a black bird traced the outline of empty perches and landed anyway. The dragon keepers lit lamps in habit and called names in case names were keys. The lamps answered with moths and the names with echoes, and those answers were not nothing. In the north, a lord who had looked winter in the teeth sent a letter written like a handshake, firm, brief, warm in the seams. Bread followed it as if it were a prayer that grew legs. In the vale, white balconies nodded. We will not be unreasonable in the musical accent of high cliffs. The riverlands straightened their back from mud and showed green where ash had been, tender and stubborn. He learned the cost of each loaf and the name of each bridge with a limping plank. He learned which roofs leak into which beds. He learned the faces of stable boys and the corners where grievances collect like damp. He asked older women to tell him about prices as if they were maps. He asked old soldiers to describe silence as if it were a weapon. His scribes slept badly because the lists were long. He slept lightly because kings do, when they are real. At court, men used to thunder, learn to like chairs, and let their speeches go barefoot. Petitions came prepared to plead and were surprised into conversation. When tempers rose, he did not strike them with force. He held them as a smith holds iron, turning, cooling, shaping into usefulness, or setting aside until they can be handled. When whispers of replacement scuttled under doors, he did not chase them. He fed the house and let the whispers go hungry. The first winter under his watch arrived with the discipline of old snow. Roofs were mended in time. The granaries remembered what they were sworn to remember. The poor hated winter, but no more than usual, which to a ruler is a kind of victory. He visited the Dragonpit as one visits an elder in a sick room, hat in hand, voice low. The rubble had settled into unhelpful dignity. He set a small candle on a block of fallen stone and left without waiting for a lesson. In the kitchens he asked for the recipe of the brown bread that soldiers swear by, and learned it by heart. In the mornings he sent loaves to the septs without banners attached. The shepherd's flock thinned, as bread did the work sermons promise. At the docks he met a shipmaster who had known 5 kings and preferred storms. They spoke of rope and luck and the quick arithmetic of currents. He left with a map drawn in chalk on the back of a barrel lid, and instructions for sending grain up the coast when the rivers sulked. He listened to a mason explain why archers hold more kindly than lintels, and nodded as if theology were being shared. Afterward, the city began to wear curves that caught light softer. He allowed the throne to be a bench when children were brought to complain of marbles and cats and the law of turns. He allowed the throne to be lightning when lords came for special winds. He walked the yard where his mother's dragon had bled out. He did not dramatize the air. He did not scold the stone. He did not promise revenge to the space. He stood there long enough for the guards to lower their eyes, and then he went to the accounts. Quiet, which had been in exile, returned with a pack and began to build a house. It wasn't obedient. Nothing living is, but it nested under eaves and in courtyards, and in the folds of sleeves and between syllables at council. The realm learned to speak around it. Funerals happened without shouting. Weddings happened with it. Babies were named with the kind of laughter that belongs in chapels. Bards, shameless and necessary, visited every village that still had a roof and sang a new refrain. The day is more stubborn than night. Sometimes they added the old refrain in a softer key. Dragons sleep now. The sky has room for weather again. In the mountain valleys where Nettles taught the goat paths to remember her name, the wind took a census in a language only goats answer. It found a girl and a dragon that chose not to grow into a banner. She slept with a knife under her cloak and awoke with no one to apologize to. She watered the fire with milk when it sulked. She traded wool and silence for salt and tales. When she heard of kings and quiet, she nodded as if the forest had predicted it, then made stew. In the reach, silverware reappeared on tables without shame. In dawn, wine returned to sneer more poetically. In the Westerlands, miners found old seams under new caution and thanked arithmetic. In the Stormlands, Thunder practiced being about weather only. He saw to it that letters moved faster than rumors. Ravenry was treated like cavalry. They were fed, praised, and threatened with redundancy if they grew lazy. Words arrived before Panic learned to choose its outfit, and Market stood down. He wrote to the Citadel and asked for healers and harvesters to be honored like men who win tournaments. Old men in chains pondered for a season and then gave prizes to people with mud on their boots. He allowed the songs of the dead dragons to be sung at festivals, but asked that they be sung at dusk, not noon. People discovered they preferred dancing to wailing in the brighter hours. When a rumor flowered that eggs had been found in some forgotten cellar, he sent riders not to seize but to verify, and when the seller delivered only reptiles with useful appetites, he paid the farmer for his trouble and called the rats defeated. He learned the art of letting hope down gently and giving it a seat by the fire. A year passed, then another. The stories learned to end with supper instead of smoke. On evenings when the harbor flamed gold and the gulls were vulgar with success, he walked the piers and practiced smiling with fishermen who approved of his teeth. On mornings when fog smeared the city into a guess, he let the council speak first and drank broth until they remembered the point. He grew taller the way trees do, unnoticed. And then all at once, when you compare the mark on the door, he grew quieter in the way streams do. Less splash, more depth. When threats arose, as they always do in the hedges of history, he met them not with thunder, but with weather patterns that denied them sun. A would-be usurper found himself applauded into boredom. At soft banquets, a zealot discovered his sermon scheduled opposite free bread. A sellsword captain became superintendent of bridges and misplaced his appetite for mutiny among timbers and sums. He lost temper twice and regretted it twice, and apologized in letters that would one day be quoted as proof of his weakness by men who prefer kings that cry over maps and bleed the margins. He raised taxes once for reasons that made sense and explained them at 7 taverns in person. The 7th tavern continued to boo, and he bought the room a barrel rather than a prison. He allowed a tourney because people need to be dizzy together sometimes. He asked that no dragon be worked into the banners. The colors still looked good. Squires argued about oranges and lances. Maids argued about men and the price of violets. A knight from the Fingers discovered he could dance and began to be happy. A woman from the Blackwater discovered she could sing and began to forgive her city its appetite. He watched and clapped and handed out purses with fewer coins and truer smiles. When winter returned with a proper scowl, he met it with the Old North's council, plan as if food is a kind of weather. He rationed earlier than pride prefers and later than fear proposes. He saw old men through to spring with soup and boys to manhood with work. He visited the septs and the mother houses and the silent sisters and gave them no sermons and much wheat. He visited the dragon keepers and gave them oil for chains they might never lift again. They wept and did not know why, which is how deep grief moves when it is finally treated as a guest, rather than a trespasser. At the shore he met a girl who had painted a dragon on a shell, and then painted a sleeping moon above it. He praised the moon. She shrugged and said, "You can tell when it is sleeping because the tide is kind." He wrote that down and kept the page. In chambers that used to echo with the ambitions of men whose boots remembered only marble, he held court with his shoes off sometimes, because comfort is a teacher. He asked boys from Flea Bottom what they would change. He asked girls with ink on their fingers what they would write next. He asked broken soldiers where it hurt and what dulled it. The answers were not a policy, but they were a map of where policy must begin and end. He let the iron chair be heavy when heaviness was called for, and light when laughter was a law. He allowed this to look like inconsistency to people who need swords to be rules. He called it governing. The realm called it rest. When envoys brought him news of islands and eastward cities that value coins more than childhood, He traded as if profit were a way to keep the air sweet and not a trophy. The coffers warmed without stinking. He moved statues from halls to gardens because gods look kinder under sky. The people went to see them and began to whisper softer in public, which is a kind of civic education. He invited bards to compose lullabies about washing hands and counting measures. Mothers thanked him with produce and fathers with grumbling, and both with babies who slept better. On a spring day when the river was vain and the swans performed for free, he went with a small retinue to a long, low building where scales had not rung for years and smell had not left. He stood on the pit's rim and closed his eyes and opened them again. He said 3 names, and the wind carried them around the bowl as if the world were trying on the sound for sighs. He did not cry. He rested his hand on stone until it told him it was time to go. In the night that followed, he dreamed of an egg warming under his palm and waking into something without fire. He woke with a calm he could not explain and kept it like a secret meal in harsh weather. Years, as they do, walked past with loud boots and sly smiles. Scarlet banners dulled to rust and then brightened again at dye vats. Autumns performed with professional leaves. Harvests failed and recovered. The city gained a wrinkle by the river that people called the Boy King's Bend because barges moved there easier after the stones were coaxed. He visited the bend and skipped a stone and missed and laughed and did it again and missed and laughed again. A child nearby showed him how to hold the wrist. The 3rd skip kissed the surface 3 times and sank. The king clapped. The child bowed, as all children do when applauded by crowns. He attended funerals of men who had once shouted in his first councils and now whispered with frankness in their last. He attended weddings of people he would never meet again and wished them weather. He watched his city grow a habit of small kindnesses, loaned pots, shared needles, split loaves, longer benches. He refused 3 wars and permitted 2 fights and insisted both fights be small. He was wrong once and paid with letters of apology and a new bridge. He was right once and paid with boredom and a long autumn of gossip that smelled of relief. He did not conquer anything except moods. He conquered mornings that wanted to be rumor by making them chores. He conquered evenings that wanted to be dread by making them music. He conquered the room with the throne by making it a place where children could nap if rain delayed their errands. When he was asked about legacy, he gestured to the windows and said, "Open them." On the day the last egg failed to stir in a brazier coaxed by 70 prayers, he accepted the news with the nod a farmer gives when hail completes what drought began. He ordered the brazier extinguished gently, as if the ash might keep an appointment elsewhere. So he told the keepers to keep telling the stories anyway, and to clean the perches, because dignity does not require occupancy. He spoke the sentence that would become his most misquoted: "Let them sleep as long as we are brave enough to be awake." Old men in winehouses argued about what he meant. Old women in doorways understood without asking. He grew older and did not become loud. He grew older and did not become stone. He grew older, and the city grew into him the way ivy grows into brick, rooted and green and patient. On some nights, he climbed the inner stairs alone and stood where the first of his name had looked out and seen conquest. He looked out and saw roofs and smoke that was cooking and stars that were not omens. And he counted chimneys and thought the number tolerable. In his last summer, the fields beat drought by being taught earlier. The merchants beat famine by learning to brag later. The singers beat sorrow by writing choruses easy enough that dock hands could remember them after long days. He held in his hand once more a crown made by other hands in other ends of other stories, and felt it lighter than when he had begun. He crowned a festival of lanterns instead. Boats released like wishes into safe current. Lights drifting downriver past boys and girls on the bank, counting and arguing whose goes farther, and learning that distance isn't everything. He lit one himself and did not make it a speech. It floated exactly the distance it wanted and went out in the middle with the prettiest hiss. People laughed and clapped as if the king had told a joke he intended. He bowed to the river because thank you is a law. When he lay down finally, after a rain that moved the realm from shouting back to sentences, he did not think of dragons. He thought of bread. He thought of roofs and 10,000 knees bent to mend and to teach and to pull children back from gutters and to rest dogs' heads. He thought of a boy and a girl at the pier at dusk, listening for wings and hearing only gulls and finding that enough. He thought of a map with fewer scorch marks and more ink about ferries and fairs and bridges and midwives. He thought of the long, quiet run of mornings when the city opened its eyes and did not dread the sky. He exhaled, and the day he left did the work of arriving, as days always do. The realm did not cheer. It breathed. Bells told the way old friends speak, slow, fond, full of a history that no longer needs proving. The dragon keepers washed the perches without crying. The shepherd's staff gathered dust in a corner no one swept. The hill grew grass. The pit grew flowers in places flowers used to fear. Nettles, if she heard, put another log on the fire and told the mountain her goat had kidded in the night, and she had named the kid for no one. Silverwing circled a quiet hill once and then again, and men below argued again about what it meant. The hill listened and did not. Children in the capital learned a game where you balance a pebble on your head and walk the length of a street without letting it fall. The king's name for them became the name of winning. Keep your pebble, walk your street. Historians wrote their heavy sentences, and some were wise, and some were embroidered, and all of them kept scribes employed. Mothers taught a new lullaby, the tune easy, the words useful. Hush now, the dragons sleep, the fields are ours to keep. Fathers hummed along and fell asleep before the second verse, because that is what fathers do when peace is a chore and a privilege. In the vaults, eggs that never woke cooled with dignity until even hope forgot their names and remembered instead to count bushels. On long roads that crossed the realm like sentences that refused to end, carts went out full and returned empty and went out full again. At river bends, boys fell in and were dragged out laughing and swearing to be careful next time. Some were. Girls climbed trees and came down with cherries and scraped knees, and mothers armed with vinegar. Some mothers kissed and some scolded, and both were right. Somewhere a widow sold back the last ring and bought seeds and did the math and found the math working. Somewhere a lord sold a tapestry and built a bridge and pretended to be annoyed when the song remembered the bridge and not the tapestry. In inns, men who had fought each other under different banners learned to play cards without cheating more than necessary. In temples, candles burned because people like being warm in beautiful rooms. In fields, dust rose and fell in the old dance that makes supper. And in the pit, on a morning of mild weather and many errands, a child climbed where she had been told not to and looked across the bowl of a city that had forgiven itself and saw for a heartbeat the shape of something vast sleeping just below the surface of stone. She waved as children wave at animals in dreams. The animal did not stir. She climbed down, scolded and grinning, and ran to catch her mother's hand, and the two of them disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by a day that had no opinion about their name and every intention of being gentle. The sky held blue like water cupped in two good hands. The river muttered its permanent poem. Chimneys counted, bells remembered weddings, cats made their rounds, kings turned into stories that end before the fire does. And if sometimes when fog drifts in from the bay and oil lamps make small moons in window glass, an old keeper on night watch thinks he hears a breath from the dark below the hill, he smiles and adjusts his cloak and says aloud to the empty, "Sleep as long as you like. We are awake."